We have been sold a lie carved in pristine white marble. For centuries, we've looked back at ancient Greece as a sun-drenched utopia of philosophy, democracy, and noble love. We see the statues of Apollo and Aphrodite and imagine a world of enlightened romance. But marble is cold and it's porous. It soaks up the blood of the stories we choose to forget. If you peel back the gold leaf of the Golden Age, you'll find a landscape of silent screams. This wasn't just a world of poets and symposiums. It was a world built on the systematic breaking of bodies and the commodification of the human soul. Tonight, we aren't looking at the pedestal. We're looking at the dirt beneath it. Welcome to the darker realities of ancient Greek intimacy, where love was often just another word for ownership, and the ghosts of the silenced are finally starting to speak. The romanticized image of the Greek Erastes and Eromenos often obscures a calculated system of social dominance and psychological conditioning. Rather than a simple exchange of wisdom for affection, this bond functioned as a rigid hierarchy where power was the primary currency between the older citizen and the adolescent. The relationship was governed by strict social protocols that prioritized the preservation of the elder's status while testing the younger's ability to submit without losing his future masculine authority. Underneath the poetic verses of Sappho or the dialogues of Plato lay a reality of intense scrutiny, where intimacy was a public performance of civic duty rather than a private emotional refuge. The education provided was less about intellectual enlightenment and more about the successful assimilation of the youth into a hyper-competitive, patriarchal elite structure. Within this framework, the concept of consent was largely replaced by a sense of unavoidable social obligation that the young boy had to navigate. The Eromenos was expected to remain stoic and unresponsive to physical pleasure, as showing enjoyment would suggest a feminine passivity that could ruin his future political career. This created a paradoxical psychological environment where the youth was pursued for his beauty but shamed if he succumbed to the desire of his pursuer too easily or too eagerly. It was a cold, transactional dance where the older man sought to exert his dominance and the younger man fought to maintain his dignity under the weight of an asymmetrical power dynamic. This was not a pursuit of mutual passion, but a high-stakes grooming process designed to reinforce the boundaries of the ruling class. The trauma of this noble bond is rarely discussed in classical texts, yet it resonates through the legal and social anxieties of the era. If a young man failed to transition properly from the submissive role to the dominant role, he risked becoming a social pariah, mocked in the comedies of Aristophanes as wide-procted or soft. This pressure turned the most intimate moments into a battlefield of reputation, where the fear of losing one's future status hung over every encounter like a shadow. The older mentor held the keys to the boy's social advancement, making the attraction inherently coercive, regardless of the flowery language used by the philosophers of the day. It was a system that demanded the sacrifice of the youth's autonomy to satisfy the ego and the legacy of the established Athenian citizen. Beyond the elite circles, this practice served as a mechanism to exclude anyone who did not fit the narrow definition of the ideal citizen-to-be. While the marble statues celebrate the physical perfection of the youth, they ignore the psychological fracturing required to mold a human being into a political instrument. The intimacy of the Erastes was often a form of possession, a way for the elder to claim a piece of the future while asserting his current virility and social standing. The pedagogy involved was frequently a lesson in cruelty and the normalization of inequality, teaching the youth that love was inextricably linked to the exercise of power over another. This darker reality suggests that the foundational love of Greek society was actually a rehearsal for the systemic oppression that defined their broader world. Ultimately, the myth of enlightened pederasty was a narrative tool used to justify a culture of grooming that served the needs of the state over the individual. By framing these relationships as a path to virtue, the Greeks effectively silenced the voices of those who found the practice invasive or emotionally devastating. The revenge of this history lies in the cracks of the marble, in the realization that what we called philosophy was often a mask for the commodification of young bodies. As we look back, we must see the Eromenos not as a willing participant in a golden age, but as a victim of a social machine that demanded his submission before it would grant him his freedom. The pedestal of Greek intimacy was built on the suppression of the self. leaving a legacy of silence that we are only now beginning to break. The respectable Athenian wife lived as a ghost within the very walls intended to protect her, her existence defined by a profound and chilling isolation. Known as the gynoeceum, the women's quarters were often located on the upper floors of the home, physically separating the female sphere from the vibrant intellectual life of the street. Here, intimacy was not a meeting of souls, but a clinical necessity for the production of legitimate heirs to sustain the city-state's citizen population. She was legally a perpetual minor, transitioning from the shadow of her father to the shadow of a husband who was often a stranger twice her age. Her voice was never heard in the assembly, and her name was rarely spoken in public, for a virtuous woman was one whom men did not talk about. This systematic erasure ensured that her desires and fears remained buried beneath the weight of domestic duty and the cold expectations of a patriarchal lineage. Marriage was a contract of property rather than a union of affection, orchestrated by men who viewed the female body as a fertile but dangerous field to be tilled. The bride was often a mere child of 14, thrust into the bed of a 30-year-old man who viewed her primarily as a functional manager of his household. In this lopsided dynamic, true emotional intimacy was regarded with suspicion, as a husband who loved his wife too much was seen as weak or susceptible to feminine manipulation. Her purpose was distilled into the spinning of wool and the bearing of sons, a life of repetitive labor conducted in the dim light of oil lamps and shuttered windows. She was a prisoner of her status, guarded by a society that equated a woman's visibility with her immorality and her silence with her highest virtue. The hearth she tended was not a symbol of warmth, but the center of a gilded cage that restricted her movement to the narrowest of corridors. The psychological toll of this confinement manifested in a culture of surveillance where the wife's every gesture was scrutinized for signs of betrayal or impropriety. Even within her own home, she was often barred from the andron, the men's dining room, where her husband entertained guests with wine, poetry, and the company of more liberated companions. While the men outside debated the nature of justice and beauty, the wife remained in the dark, her intellectual potential withered by a lack of education and social stimulation. This enforced ignorance was a deliberate tool of control, ensuring she remained dependent and incapable of challenging the rigid structures that governed her very breath. Her protection was a form of house arrest, justified by a medical and philosophical belief that women were inherently irrational and prone to wild, destructive impulses if left ungoverned. The intimacy she experienced was frequently a lonely, transactional encounter, devoid of the intellectual fire that the Greeks so famously celebrated in their public lives. In this landscape of domestic solitude, the wife's only form of power was the management of enslaved people who were often more privy to her true self than her own husband. These internal relationships between the mistress and the enslaved were fraught with their own tensions, creating a complex web of shared misery and domestic friction. Yet even this small circle of influence was fragile, as any perceived failure in her duties could lead to her being cast out and shamed, losing her dowry and her children. The threat of replacement was a constant specter, as men were legally permitted and socially encouraged to seek passion and companionship outside the marital bed with impunity. Her life was a long, slow exercise in endurance, characterized by the muffled sounds of a world she was forbidden to join and a family that viewed her as a utility. This was the dark reality of the noble Greek household, where the cornerstone of society was a woman whose humanity had been hollowed out to serve a citizen's pride. The revenge of the silent wife is found in the tragic plays of the era, where figures like Medea and Clytemnestra reflect the explosive consequences of such extreme repression. These fictional monsters were the nightmares of a society that knew, on some level, that the domestic peace they enjoyed was built on a foundation of profound systemic cruelty. The marble facades of Athens hide the reality of thousands of women who lived and died without ever being truly known, their identities swallowed by the state. Their intimacy was a stolen thing, a fragment of a life lived in the cracks of a world that feared their potential and loathed their necessity. To look at the Greek family today is to peer into a void where the echoes of these forgotten women still vibrate against the ancient stone walls. They were the silent architects of the city, yet they were treated as nothing more than the furniture of their masters' lives, forever trapped behind the veil. The hetairai are frequently painted as the liberated anomalies of the ancient world, yet this veneer of freedom masks a sophisticated system of high-stakes sexual labor. Unlike the sequestered wives, these women were permitted to enter the andron, engaging in the intellectual and political debates that shaped the very foundations of Western thought. However, their presence was never a sign of true equality. They were expensive ornaments designed to reflect the status and cultural sophistication of the men who hired them. Their education in music, philosophy, and rhetoric was not a pursuit of self-actualization, but a necessary professional investment to ensure their marketability in a competitive trade. Behind the alluring smiles and the refined conversation was the reality of a life lived at the whim of wealthy patrons who viewed them as temporary luxuries. The perceived agency of the hetaira was a fragile construct, entirely dependent on her ability to maintain a youthful mask and a sharp tongue, in a world that discarded women the moment they ceased to be useful. The intimacy offered by these companions was a carefully choreographed performance, a simulated connection that required constant emotional labor and psychological agility. While they might share wine with generals and poets, they remained social outsiders, often the daughters of foreigners or freed slaves who could never achieve the legal protections of a citizen. This lack of social standing meant that their survival was inextricably linked to their sexual and intellectual labor, creating a constant state of precariousness. Every witty remark and every spontaneous gesture of affection was a calculated move in a game where the stakes were nothing less than their continued existence. The warmth they provided was a commodity bought and sold in the marketplace, leaving little room for genuine vulnerability or a life lived outside the gaze of their masters. Beneath the silk robes lay the exhaustion of a woman who was never allowed to be weary, lest her patron turn his attention to a younger, fresher alternative. The darkness of this trade becomes even more apparent when considering the inevitable decline that awaited these women as they aged out of the industry. Without the safety net of a family or the legal rights of a wife, a retired hetaira often faced a bleak and impoverished future unless she had managed to hoard enough wealth to buy her own security. Many were forced to transition into the role of a madam, perpetuating the very cycle of commodification that had defined their own youth, or they fell into the ranks of the common pornai. The stories we hear of Neaera or Phryne are the exceptions that prove the rule, highlighting the rare few who survived a system designed to consume them. For the vast majority, intimacy was the exhausting marathon of performative joy that left their internal lives hollowed out and their futures uncertain. Their liberation was a cruel illusion, a slightly larger cage that allowed them to see the sun but never truly feel its warmth without a price tag attached. Furthermore, the romanticized narrative of the intellectual companion ignores the inherent violence of a society that required women to be toys for men's minds as well as their bodies. Even the most famous hetairai were subject to public humiliation and legal attacks, as seen in the frequent trials where their characters were assassinated to settle political scores between their lovers. Their bodies were battlegrounds for male egos, and their reputations were currency used by men to prove their own worldliness or to mock their rivals. The intimacy they shared was frequently weaponized against them, turned into evidence of their supposed corruption whenever it became politically convenient for the elite. They were the subjects of ribald poetry and cruel jokes, their humanity reduced to a series of anecdotes and prices in the annals of history. The influence they wielded was a double-edged sword that could be turned against them at any moment, leaving them defenseless in a legal system written entirely by and for men. The legacy of the hetairai is a haunting reminder that in ancient Greece, even the most empowered women were still products in a marketplace of male desire. We must look past the anecdotes of their wit to see the cold reality of a life where one's value was determined by the pleasure they could provide to others. Their laughter in the symposium was a survival tactic, a way to navigate a world that offered them no other path to influence or safety. To celebrate them as icons of early feminism is to ignore the structural trauma and the constant threat of destitution that shadowed their every step. They were the beautiful ghosts of the Greek dinner party, essential for the evening's entertainment but ultimately expendable once the torches were extinguished. Their story is not one of romance, but of a calculated high-end exploitation that turned intimacy into a grueling profession of the soul. The most harrowing shadow cast across the ancient world was the absolute erasure of the enslaved body within the state-sanctioned sex trade. In the eyes of the law, these individuals were not humans capable of feeling or consent, but rather andropoda, human-footed stock, to be used until they were physically or mentally broken. The porni, the lowest tier of workers in the city's state-run brothels, lived in conditions that resembled a factory of human misery rather than any recognizable form of intimacy. They were often survivors of war, kidnapped during raids or sold by desperate families, their past identities stripped away and replaced by a price tag in the Athenian market. This was a world where the most private parts of a human being were considered public infrastructure, maintained for the health of the citizen male. The horror of their existence lay in the total absence of a self, as every hour of their lives belonged to a master who viewed their trauma as a mere overhead cost. The architecture of these brothels was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum comfort, turning the act of intimacy into a repetitive, mechanized labor. Enslaved workers were often confined to small, windowless cells where they were expected to service a constant stream of customers from sunrise to sunset for a few copper coins. There was no recourse for the violence they endured at the hands of drunken patrons, as the law only protected the property rights of the slave owner, never the physical integrity of the slave. To the Greek state, these individuals were essential, living tools that absorbed the darker impulses of society, shielding the virtuous citizen women from the appetites of the men. Their internal lives were irrelevant to a system that measured their value only by the endurance of their flesh and the coins they could generate. This was not a side effect of the culture, but a foundational pillar that allowed the civilized elite to maintain their lofty illusions of grace. The psychological devastation of this life was a silent plague that left no written record, for the victims were denied the literacy and the voice to tell their own stories. We only see them in the margins of comedy and pottery, often depicted as objects of ridicule or as background furniture in a scene of male revelry. The revenge of the slave was not found in grand revolts, but in the quiet, desperate preservation of their own sanity amidst a culture that demanded their total psychological collapse. They lived in a state of perpetual mourning for the lives they had lost and the autonomy they would never regain, their bodies used as a canvas for the cruelty of a dominant class. Every touch they received was an act of theft, a violation of the soul that was legalized and encouraged by the greatest philosophers of the age. The cold indifference of the city toward their suffering remains one of the most profound indictments of the Athenian democratic experiment. This system of exploitation extended beyond the brothels into the private households, where enslaved domestic workers were subject to the absolute sexual whims of their masters. There was no concept of adultery when it involved a slave, as the master's right to use his property was considered absolute and unquestionable by social norms. Children born from these forced unions were often born into slavery themselves, creating a tragic cycle where a father could legally sell his own offspring for profit. The intimacy forced upon the enslaved was a weapon of control, a way to remind them every single day that they did not even own the boundaries of their own skin. It was a suffocating environment of forced proximity where the slave had to anticipate the master's desires to avoid physical punishment, turning survival into a grueling performance of submission. The household hearth, often idealized as a sacred space, was frequently a site of hidden terror for those who served within its walls. To look back at the glory of Greece without acknowledging the screams of the porne is to be complicit in a historical lie of massive proportions. The marble temples and the soaring speeches were paid for with the systematic destruction of millions of lives that were deemed naturally inferior by the ruling elite. We must recognize that the freedom of the Athenian citizen was bought with the literal and figurative chains of those forced into sexual servitude. Their invisibility in our history books is the final insult, a continuation of the silence that was forced upon them while they were still breathing. By unearthing these darker realities, we finally grant a modicum of dignity to the ghosts who were once treated as nothing more than biological machines. Their story is the ultimate revenge of history, a reminder that no civilization is truly great if its foundation is built upon the crushed spirits of the silenced and the enslaved. In the iron-fisted state of Sparta, intimacy was stripped of its private sanctity and transformed into a cold, eugenic tool for the preservation of the military machine. Unlike the Athenians who hid their domestic lives, the Spartans viewed the union of bodies as a public utility, strictly regulated to ensure the production of the ultimate hoplite. From the moment of birth, the potential for intimacy was overshadowed by the state's demand for physical perfection, creating a society where emotional bonds were secondary to biological efficiency. Men and women were groomed not for partnership, but for the specialized labor of breeding a warrior class that could dominate the Peloponnese through sheer physical terror. This was a world where the heart was an afterthought, and the bedchamber was merely an extension of the training barracks, overseen by the watchful eyes of the ephors. The love nurtured here was a love of the state, fueled by the forced sacrifice of individual desire on the altar of collective strength. The ritual of marriage in Sparta was a chilling performance of aggression that mirrored the violence of their battlefield tactics and social hierarchies. A bride was not walked down an aisle, but was symbolically captured in a mock abduction, her head shaved to the scalp to strip away her feminine identity. Dressed in men's clothing and left in a darkened room, she awaited a husband who had to sneak away from his barracks under the cover of night to consummate the union. This clandestine meeting was designed to keep the fires of passion burning through scarcity, ensuring that the act of procreation remained a vigorous and high-energy endeavor. The husband would return to his mess hall before dawn, often living this way for years without ever seeing his wife in the honest light of day. This enforced distance turned the most intimate of acts into a tactical mission, devoid of the soft comforts of a shared domestic life or steady companionship. Within this eugenic framework, the Spartan woman was granted a level of physical freedom that horrified other Greeks. But this liberty was merely a mandate for reproductive health. She was expected to exercise in public, wrestling and throwing the javelin alongside men, so that her body would be strong enough to withstand the trauma of multiple births. Her value was measured in the quality of the sons she produced, and she was socially conditioned to prioritize their military utility over their physical survival. If a woman was barren or a man was aging, the state encouraged wife-sharing, where a younger, more vigorous male would be brought in to impregnate the woman for the sake of the lineage. This was not a move toward sexual liberation, but a cold calculation that viewed human beings as pedigree livestock meant to be optimized for the state's survival. The emotional fallout of these arrangements was ignored, suppressed by a culture that demanded stoicism in the face of the most profound personal violations. The psychological landscape of Spartan intimacy was further complicated by the agoge, the brutal educational system that separated boys from their families at the age of 7. This systemic severance of the mother-child bond ensured that the primary loyalty of every Spartan man was to his fellow soldiers rather than to a wife or a home. Intimacy was redirected into the phalanx, where the bonds between men were forged through shared hardship, ritualized combat, and the constant threat of state-sanctioned violence. When these men did return to their wives, they were often strangers to the concept of gentleness, having been raised in a world where vulnerability was a death sentence. The home was not a sanctuary but a temporary lodging, and the wife was not a partner but a strategic asset in the ongoing war of demographics. This created a profound sense of isolation within the union, as both parties were trained to view each other through the lens of duty and biological output. Ultimately, the Spartan breeding machine represents the total colonization of the human spirit by the demands of a hyper-militarized government. The revenge of this history lies in the eventual collapse of the Spartan population, as their rigid eugenic standards and constant warfare led to a terminal decline in their numbers. By treating intimacy as a mechanical process rather than a human need, they hollowed out the very society they sought to protect with their shields. The ghosts of Sparta are those of parents who were forbidden from grieving and lovers who were never allowed to truly know one another beyond the dark. Their story serves as a haunting reminder that when a state claims ownership over the bodies and beds of its people, it sacrifices the very humanity it claims to defend. The legacy of Sparta is not just one of courage and discipline, but of a profound and systemic loneliness that defined the lives of its most elite citizens. The legal landscape of ancient intimacy was not governed by the heart, but by the cold, razor-sharp edge of property law and civic honor. To the Greeks, adultery was far more than a personal betrayal. It was a profound violation of a man's estate and the purity of his lineage. A husband who discovered an intruder in his wife's quarters held the absolute state-sanctioned power of life and death over the transgressor. This was not viewed as a crime of passion, but as a legitimate defense of his most vital social assets. The law allowed for the immediate execution of the interloper, provided the act was witnessed and the killer did not use a concealed weapon. In this world, the bedchamber was a potential crime scene where the state invited the citizen to act as judge, jury, and executioner. If the husband chose to stay his hand, the alternative was a ritual of public humiliation designed to strip the intruder of his dignity. A common punishment involved the raphanidosis, where a radish was painfully inserted into the transgressor's body and his pubic hair was plucked with hot ash. This gruesome spectacle served as a warning to others that the boundaries of the citizen's home were guarded by both violence and shame. The intimacy of the home was protected not out of respect for the relationship, but to ensure that no spurious blood entered the family line. Every sexual encounter outside the rigid lines of the law was a gamble with one's life or social standing. This environment turned desire into a minefield where the cost of a mistake was often paid in blood and permanent social exile. For the woman caught in the center of this legal storm, the consequences were a form of living death that erased her from society. She was not executed, but she was forcibly divorced and stripped of every right that granted her a place in the community. She was barred from attending public sacrifices and forbidden from wearing any jewelry or fine clothing that might signify her status. If she dared to enter a temple, any citizen could tear her clothes from her body or strike her without legal repercussion. Her identity was effectively annihilated, leaving her a pariah in a world where a woman's survival depended entirely on her social standing. This legalized cruelty ensured that a woman's life was a constant exercise in fear, knowing one accusation could end her existence. The obsession with pure bloodlines meant that the child of an adulterous union faced a future of immediate and total disenfranchisement. These children were often cast out, losing any claim to their father's property or the rights of citizenship that defined an ancient man's life. The fear of the bastard was so potent that it justified the most extreme forms of surveillance and domestic control seen in the ancient world. This legal framework turned every household into a fortress of suspicion where intimacy was secondary to the security of the inheritance. The state did not care for the emotional wreckage of a broken marriage, it only cared for the integrity of the ledger. Intimacy was thus a hostage to the law, a fragile thing that could be crushed the moment it threatened the patriarchal order. The revenge of this system lies in the profound anxiety that permeated the poetry and plays of the era, reflecting a culture haunted by its own rules. The very laws meant to protect the honor of the home often led to cycles of blood feuds and social decay that could tear entire families apart. By turning the private act of love into a public matter of property and violence, the Greeks created a society where true vulnerability was impossible. The marble ruins we admire today are the silent witnesses to a justice system that prioritized the cold logic of ownership over the warmth of human connection. To understand Greek intimacy is to understand a world where the law was a shadow lurking in every corner of the bedroom. It remains a chilling reminder of what happens when the state's demand for order overrides the basic humanity of its citizens.